What is child abuse? You'd think it would be a simple question, right? But some fascinating new research shows that where we, as a society, draw that line is anything but simple. And that disagreement? It has some really profound consequences for how we protect children.
So let's just get right to it. This is the central question. Is a single, awful act enough to be called abuse? Or does it need to be a pattern of behavior over time where we draw that line has life-altering consequences, and as this research shows, we don't all draw it in the same place?
And make no mistake, this isn't just some academic debate. Look at this number. That's over 500,000 children identified as victims in just 1 year in the U.S. alone. And remember, those are only the substantiated cases, the ones that were officially investigated and confirmed. The real number is almost certainly way, way higher. And here's the core issue that researchers Varavei and Harman really wanted to get at. They argue that this lack of unity, this fundamental disagreement on what abuse even is, seriously hampers our ability to protect kids effectively. So their work dives right into that murky water. Okay, so let's start with the most basic question the research tackled. How many times does something bad have to happen before we call it abuse? In academic speak, this is a question of chronicity. It's a bit of a technical term, but the idea is simple. How often, or for how long, does the behavior happen? The answer, it turns out, tells us a whole lot about our collective gut feeling on the matter. And wow, the results here are pretty overwhelming. For physical abuse, sexual abuse, and even for most types of psychological abuse and parental alienation, the public consensus is clear. It only needs to happen once. That points to a really strong kind of zero-tolerance view in society.
But, it's never that simple, is it? That zero-tolerance rule doesn't apply to every single action. And when we dig a little deeper into the specifics of psychological abuse, a much more nuanced picture starts to come into focus.
And this slide just lays it out perfectly. Look at the left side. Things like terrorizing a child, intimidating them, degrading them. A huge majority of people say that's abuse the very first time it happens. But then look at the right. For other behaviors, like blaming a child for everything or confining them, people tend to see it as abusive only if it becomes a repeated pattern. That is such a critical distinction for the professionals who have to make these calls. Okay, ready for another layer? Because it turns out that who is looking at the situation matters a lot. Our background, our gender, our ethnicity, they all seem to act like a filter for how we define what's harmful. Let's just take gender, for instance. The study found that, on average, the male participants needed a behavior to happen more than twice as often as the female participants did before they'd be willing to call it psychological abuse. That's a really significant gap in perception. And ethnicity plays a big part too. The study used African Americans as a baseline for comparison. What they found was that both Asian American and Hispanic/Latino participants generally required more instances of a behavior before they classified it as psychological abuse or parental alienation. It just goes to show how much our cultural context can shape our personal thresholds for harm. And the list of factors just keeps going. Your age can make a difference, even your own personal history. For example, the study noted that older participants sometimes had a higher tolerance for certain behaviors, things that younger generations might immediately call out as abusive. It really shows how these definitions can shift over time. So to really see how all these perception gaps play out in a real and frankly super contentious situation, the research zooms in on a specific form of abuse, parental alienation.
So what is it? Well, at its core, it's a pattern of behaviors, like constantly bad-mouthing the other parent, interfering with their time, or making a child feel guilty for loving them, all designed to turn a child against that other parent. It's now being recognized more and more as a really severe form of psychological abuse. Now, a very common criticism you'll hear is that claims of parental alienation are just a cynical legal tactic, that it's used by abusive parents, often fathers, to distract from their own bad behavior. But the research team decided to look at the data from hundreds of court cases to see if that was actually true. And what they found was the complete opposite. A parent who was found by a court to be alienating their child was over 81% more likely to also have a substantiated, a proven claim of abuse against them. And get this, the other side of that coin is just as telling. The targeted parent, the one being alienated, was over 86% more likely to have false, unsubstantiated abuse claims weaponized against them by the alienator. So the data strongly suggests that alienation isn't a defense against a false claim. It's often a tool used by an actual abuser. Behind all these statistics are real people, real lives.
This quote from a father who went through it, it just captures the absolutely devastating, all-consuming damage this kind of abuse can do.
Okay, so why does all of this matter? Why is it so important to understand these different perceptions? Well, because it all points to this fundamental disconnect, right at the very heart of our child protection systems.
And this really is the core of the problem. On one hand, you've got public opinion, which says loud and clear, once is enough. But on the other hand, you have our legal and social systems, which, for a lot of reasons, often need a very high burden of proof. They often need a documented, proven pattern of harm before they can step in.
So, let's just bring it all home. What have we learned? Well, first, the public generally has a zero-tolerance policy on abuse. But second, our own identity, our gender, our ethnicity, our age, it all acts as a filter on what we even define as harmful in the first place. Third, we see that parental alienation is a real form of abuse with devastating and measurable consequences. And finally, all this leads to a dangerous gap between what the public feels is wrong and what our systems can actually act on. A gap where vulnerable children can fall right through.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly challenging question. When our own personal and cultural ideas about harm are so different, how on earth do we build a single system that can be fair, be effective, and truly protect every single child?